Welcome to Bible Over Brews, deep pots fermented over time and text. I'm coming at you, Aaron Crew Juice Baverka, and I've got Mike.
Howdy.
Gumby.
Hey, what's up?
Keith.
Salutations.
Zechariah.
Oh.
Theo.
Hello from the
And our
palm.
guest, Suan Sonna, I believe you pronounce it.
Yep, you got it right.
All right, awesome. And we're going to be diving into what is the Papacy. But before we do that, we are going to express the fact that we are dining on Four Roses bourbon. It is delicious and delectable. Mix up your favorite cocktail with a sophisticated contemporary flair with this widespread favorite. Enjoy this smooth and mellow bourbon with its long and soft finish. Savor its unique aromas and flavors in your favorite bourbon cocktail, on the rocks or with a splash. 80% proof and 40% alcohol by volume. And we are tonight drinking this in more or less a Manhattan. Yeah. All right. Cheers.
Shout out to our bartender.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you, sir.
Is it really that red? That's just incredibly red.
Oh, so that's the maraschino syrup.
Oh, okay. That explains so much.
Plus you add maraschino cherries and the bitters. So. Zechariah, what do you have over there?
I'm just sticking with my usual Old Rasputin Russian Imperial Stout.
I love a good Russian Imperial Stout.
Is it the breakfast stout?
No, just normal stout.
Normal one.
Speaking of breakfast stout, since we have a newborn and I'm a little bit sleep deprived, my brew today is actually coffee. It's out of my AeroPress with the Prismo pressure actuated attachment. It's Zelly Beans El Salvatore Mapache Estate, and I ruined it with some Smirnoff.
Nice.
So this has a Russian twist.
Yes.
Yeah. I also use an AeroPress, and I'm
There's
drinking
coffee.
the local brand of Mount Strata coffee, high altitude aerobic specialty coffee beans grown here in the mountains and the Himalayas from Nepal.
Oh, that sounds delightful.
Great.
We should do a morning podcast.
Right?
Oh yeah, different beans.
That would be awesome.
I mean, it is a morning podcast with you.
Coffee is a brew.
So, Swan, can you tell us about your
Bible over
background and
Brews.
fill us in for our audience?
Yeah, well, let me begin by thanking all of you for having me on. Basically, so my name is Suan Sonna. I'm a philosophy student at Kansas State University. Right now, in my third year. After this semester, I got 1 year left, and then I'll be moving on with my life. So I have a podcast, YouTube channel, Facebook page called Intellectual Conservatism. And originally that page was a Facebook page about my journey from being like a democratic socialist liberal to becoming more like a Burkean conservative, or in the tradition of Aristotle and Aquinas. So that's how it started. And then now I converted to Catholicism during Pentecost 2020. And that's when I entered the church. So I've been recently a Catholic, and that's been a lot of my focus. So right now, a lot of my research and personal studies has been on things like the papacy and other Catholic doctrines. So I right now have a paper coming out in the Haythrop Journal about the Jewish roots of the papacy. So I'm excited. I don't know when that's coming out just yet. I finished all the edits and they accepted it. So we'll see.
Awesome. Well, I loved your
definitely
debate on your channel for the Papacy. It was really good.
Yeah, thanks.
You hands down won that debate.
I appreciate it, man.
I remember there was a voting cast.
So
It was a good debate.
yeah.
Like, you don't against Ty? Is his name Ty?
Yeah, Ty
Okay.
Ninke. Mm-hmm.
That's the Soul Scriptura one. Yeah, that was very one-sided.
I I actually felt pretty bad for him.
Yeah, I'm gonna
I'm
be
proud to
nice and
see
I
him.
won't comment.
Just a good idea
So
if you
do
want to be
you take
invited to other
notes?
debates.
I don't think you need to. I think your comments already won the day.
Swan, do you take notes when he's speaking or your debater's speaking?
Yeah, I always try to take notes on. So I don't know if you saw it in the videos, but I had like a legal pad, so I was writing down all my notes, and then I had a lot of like responses already prepared. I was anticipating certain objections, so I had all my sources organized. So that's what I was doing during his statements.
Yeah, so kind of be interested to like look over your shoulder, see what's being written down, you know?
Yeah, I
Maybe
wasn't.
This guy's up here.
Yeah, I wasn't writing anything like silly or anything like that. It was just all like, business on the papers. So that's what I focused on. Yeah.
Have you ever
Awesome.
looked over to your opponent
Well-
and seen like a giant fly on his forehead and it won't leave?
No, I haven't seen that. Not yet, at least, but that would be interesting. Hopefully it's not when I'm trying to run for president, but actually I'm not planning on that at all. I have no aspirations.
You heard it here first. He's running for president.
No, I have no political aspirations whatsoever.
Awesome. So on my past studies, I dived into studies from Brad Petrie. That's where I actually took my notes from tonight. So, and I noticed that you actually hit most of those points in your debate. So, which is pretty cool. So, for example, if you go over Jesus and the keys of the kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know if you
Yeah.
want to talk
So.
about that.
Yeah, I mean, so when it comes to Brant Petrie's work, I think all he's done is, I think, one lecture on YouTube about it. I'm not sure if he's actually written anything else about the particular issue. I know he's written more about the Eucharist and the Blessed Mother. So yeah, I mean, I thought he did a great job in that lecture. And when it comes to the keys of the kingdom, there's a lot that can be said, but basically, the keys of the kingdom appear in Matthew 16:19 after Peter makes his confession to Christ, and Christ says, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. So that's an allusion back to Isaiah 22:22, when Shebna, who was the former prime minister, I think he was under King Hezekiah, he ends up dishonoring God, basically. And then God in Isaiah 22:22 strips him of his office and gives the keys of the house of David to Eliakim. And then God says, whatever you open, none shall shut, and whatever you shut, none shall open. So there's clearly a parallel that's going on there. And I can go into more like the reasons why the parallel is not just something we're imagining, but it's something actually, I would say, intended by Matthew, right? But the keys in the ancient times of Israel had two functions. So one of the functions was that it would serve as the symbol of the prime minister's authority. The prime minister served second in command to the king. And when the king was not immediately present at the throne or was out maybe doing some diplomatic matters, then the prime minister would become the regent of the kingdom while the king was gone. So in some sense, you could say he's his vicar. The second power of the keys was to open the palace and to decide who could enter and who, had to leave or be expelled. So for instance, the NIV Cultural Background Bible talks about how, the keys on one hand gave the prime minister the ability to open every single official palace door. I think it was in Jerusalem. And then also the 1970 New Bible Commentary edited by Donald Guthrie and others talks about how the keys represent the authority of the prime minister to be second in command to the king himself, and everyone else was under him.
Yeah.
So do we have parallels
pretty
like
intense.
Joseph with Pharaoh?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, in Roland DeVoe's book, Ancient Israel, Its Life and Institutions, DeVoe talks about when it comes to, so the prime minister is also called the master of the palace or the steward of the palace. And basically what one notices is that the powers of the Davidic prime minister were incredibly similar to those of the vizier under the Pharaoh in Egypt. So basically in the book of Genesis, when Joseph is given the ability to be second in command to the Pharaoh, and he becomes his vizier, It also says that the pharaoh made him master of his house or of his palace. And then DeVoe begins to trace out some parallels between, for instance, the prime minister and the vizier. So he actually makes the argument that what happens is when the Davidic monarchy is built up, it basically inherits a lot of some of the Egyptian institutions that were there hundreds of years before under Joseph, and now, being brought into the Davidic kingdom. So there are parallels, yeah, between Joseph's time in Egypt and the construction of the Davidic kingdom.
And it
So,
carries on, I guess, with Daniel in Persia, right?
I'm not sure about that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's the extent of my knowledge, I'll say. Mhm.
so what have you run across, or what are your thoughts on, say, the work that has been done that sort of gets into some of the rabbinic discussions on Shebna and Eliakim, and interprets him more as a high priest figure, and the parallels between like the keys and the keys of the temple? You have anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't. Yeah, I mean, so I'm right now actually learning to kind of read the rabbinic literature and dive in. I've done some basic work into it. I've looked into some of the parallels, but not everything.
Yeah.
So when it comes to, for instance, what the rabbis have said about Shebna and Eliakim, I haven't read anything about that. So I'm probably going to have to investigate that later. But I do know, for instance, when you talked about like the keys to like the temple, that was certainly something that was there in the Second Temple period. I think also, Craig S. Keener in his 2014 IVP New Testament commentary, he talks about how the rabbis would sometimes use the language of the keys of knowledge. And especially Matthew Henry's Bible commentary kind of includes how there were different keys in Judaism that represented various different things. But I mean, I don't know if those are terribly relevant necessarily to knocking the parallel, or if they do anything to the parallel necessarily. I just think those are interesting kind of metaphors, right,
Yeah, because
for the rabbis.
where I first ran into this is when Michael Barber's Jesus' Davidic temple builder, and
Right.
he
Yeah.
goes into a whole thing of how they're looking at the words used for the garments of Shebna, and they're seeing them as priestly garments, and then he draws like this whole host of parallels about the keys of the temple being returned to God, and them representing authority. So
Yeah.
in that way, he seems to view Peter as more of a high priestly figure as opposed to simply a minister.
Right. I mean, yeah, so that's good. So when it comes to, for instance, Shebna, we know that Shebna in the Old Testament was the secretary before he was the prime minister. And as the secretary, or I think he was the treasurer, excuse me, I think he was the treasurer. As the treasurer, he would collect various taxes. And one of these taxes included the temple. So he would get the temple tax. So he was associated at least with the religious kind of life of Israel. And then when it says, in Isaiah, I think 22:21, that Shebna is stripped of his tunic and girdle. A tunic and girdle are the two things that a priest would wear. It's part of his garments, right? So it seems like Shebna then had some type of religious authority. We don't know exactly what it was, but also in the Davidic kingdom, there wasn't a strict distinction between church and state anyway. So,
Well, I mean, where is there in the ancient world?
Exactly. Yeah, and then we know, for instance, in Jewish tradition, that the tunic and the girdle also gave whoever wore it, specifically the priest, the power to forgive certain sins. So specifically, this would come into play on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement. The high priest would not just wear 4 garments; he would wear 8 garments, and each of the 8 garments were associated with the forgiveness of certain sins. So this idea that, I think it's fair to say that Peter is not just purely, right, a prime minister in a political sense. There's clearly intermingling with the spiritual reality of the world. But then, I mean, the same is true of Jesus, right? So this is kind of one of the arguments I use to defend the parallel, but Jesus is the son of David. He is the Davidic king that was prophesied in 2 Samuel 7, verses 8-14. And Jesus's kingdom is both spiritual and physical, and it has elements of the Davidic monarchy, which we would expect if he's the son of David rebuilding his father's kingdom. So, yeah, I mean, for instance, in A. Edward Szosensky's book, The Papacy and the Orthodox, I think he noted that lots of scholars have compared Peter to like a head rabbi. So maybe that's like the better intermingling of both. But yeah, he's not purely just a political prime minister. That's the key takeaway.
Do you have his genealogy? Which tribe is he from?
Talking about Jesus or
No, no, no. Of course, I'm talking about the guy with the keys in Isaiah 22, Shebna. You
yeah.
like him?
So yeah, I'm not sure. I don't think. I'm tempted to say that he wouldn't be from the line of Aaron. That's all I know, because the line of Aaron would be the ones that produce the high priests, and then um, Eliakim obviously wasn't a high priest, although he did have at least a religious significance with the things that he wore. So I don't know the genealogy of Eliakim. That might be something to look into if there's anything in the biblical text.
Awesome. And then
Well, there's some
I know that
connection also.
What's that, Theo?
I was just saying there's also the connection back to Moses. It's some scholars have dabbled in the idea that originally Moses was intended to be the single leader, and it's his rejection originally at the burning bush that causes God to bring in Aaron, and that's when the bifurcation happens. And then eventually you have like the prophets to come in top of that, and you kind of have a threefold model. But originally they're keen on a one system, one ruler system, which incidentally happens basically at times like after Daniel, or depending on where you date Daniel, but in the Hasmonean period, you just have one leader, and there's some concern in the Second Temple period literature why we don't have the two. And of course in Jesus and then the Hebrews, how it models that he's the single. And I was curious because Suan in his debate mentioned like Jesus being Moses and passing on to Joshua, which Peter becomes his Joshua. But then we're looking at this priestly aspect too, and Jesus being the high priest, and how Revelation and some other scriptures talk about from Exodus 19:6, how we're to be a kingdom of priests, or kingly priests, or royal priesthood. And the language tied all in Leviticus that he mentioned earlier about the 8 garments and that the high priest wears, and the crown he wears. And in the Old Testament, the Pentateuch specifically, there's not much talk throughout the Hebrew Bible about the king's garments so much. That's one of the aspects that is unique about the Hebrew Bible. They're not much into the priestly, the king's garments or his accoutrements. It's all about the priestly garments. And there's so much emphasis on the priest and the crowning of the priest and the wearing of that crown. And as he said, walking in the graces, and he carries the absolute presence of the grace of God for that forgiveness on Yom Kippur. And so, there's just this idea that Moses kind of dropped the ball there. You can pick that up through John Collins in his Scepter and Star, Messianic Light of the Dead Sea Scrolls. He gets into this, where Moses was to be the one, and then it gets split into two. And there's more there, but Collins is probably your lead point to get you in there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I haven't heard too much about that before, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, that was good. That was good. And then I like how it was brought up, the foundation stone, and because when you go back to the temple, that was, that's actually where the ark would have sat, right? And that's like a key element of the temple. So, and it harkens back to Matthew as well. Yeah, it harkens back to Matthew as well when he says that he is going to build it on him, and he calls him the rock. Kind of harkens back to the foundation stone of the temple.
Yeah, there's so many there's so many things that are going on in that particular phrase. It's not just right. So I think there's clearly a foundation stone parallel, and as has already been mentioned about like Jesus being the Davidic temple builder and that sort of thing, right? There's a lot that's going on in that particular passage. So I think the foundation stone parallel is important, but also Ben Witherington III in his commentary on Matthew also mentions the fact, and other people like, Anthony J. Soderini and the Erdman's commentary in the Bible have picked up on the fact that in Caesarea Philippi, there was this giant rock that stood, and it was this rock of pagan worship. And it was basically a sign to the entire world from Philip the Tetrarch that he had dedicated it to Caesar as a god, basically. And then people there worship Pan. And Ben Witherington III kind of notes that he thinks that people haven't appreciated enough the fact that Jesus kind of picks the right place, so to speak, to start talking about Peter being the rock. Because at a place where there's pagan worship, he's going to now build a new temple that's going to replace the pagans. Like it's just it's incredible. There's so much going on in just that one little phrase.
Are we talking about Mount Hermon here?
Say that again.
Are we talking about Mount Hermon here?
Oh no, not Mount Hermon. I don't know what the stone is in Caesarea Philippi called, but yeah.
Because okay.
Yeah, Hermann Bonius. Yeah, he's talking about that definitely.
Yeah, because that was where the Pan cult was, is at Mount Hermon,
Mm.
which is also, as some of our podcast listeners who share some interest will know, this is where in Second Temple literature there was thought to be one of the falls of the angels, which was especially in the Dead Sea Scroll community, Qumran was recorded in First Enoch, which was important to some Jewish sects.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, there's definitely this big air of Jesus is going to a place that's really thought of as this place of supernatural evil.
Yeah, the gates of
Mm-hmm.
Hades.
Yeah, I mean, and also I remember Steve Ray, another Catholic apologist, a while back. He talked about how there were streams around the rock that led to the underworld, and that's maybe why Jesus mentions, the gates of the netherworld or hell, right? And then I kind of thought, like, okay, maybe that's just Steve Ray, because he's not like a biblical scholar. I mean, I respect him, right? But then I actually looked and I saw, like, oh no, there's credibility to what he's saying. So, in that same commentary by Ben Witherington III, he mentions the fact that the streams surrounding the rock were believed to have led to the underworld. So then there's a lot that's going on in Matthew 16:18.
Oh yeah, Bashan is definitely in view. Yeah, Bashan
Mm-hmm.
is the gateway to the underworld. So it's basically the highway to hell in the ancient Near East. That's what it
Rules
is.
of Bashan, they encompass me, all that.
And that's all tied to the Greco-Roman Epiphanius. And then you have Isaiah 9 talking. If you look at Isaiah 9, you'll pick up on it too. And the geography of Isaiah 9 is just phenomenal, because there's the river Litani that flows across, and so he talks about the verse 9 of Isaiah. Let's see, is it chapter 9, but which verse? I'm trying to see exactly. Is it 1 or 2? But it says, but in the latter time, he's made a glorious way of the sea. That way of the sea, you follow from the Mediterranean Sea, the river Litani, and you'll run right into Mount Hermon, Bashan. You run into that whole thing. And then of course, Isaiah 9:6 is talking about the governments. And then Aaron just mentioned the ark and temple building you mentioned from Barbara's dissertation. And so the whole idea of the king was to establish the government, to build the temple, which is a representative of God on earth. And so it's the uniting of the priest and the king as God is enthroned, and his feet touch not the earth, but the ark. And it's that touch point that Aaron was getting at, that the ark is where the feet of God, the rule, the kingdom of God lands at that precise point. And Jesus, according to Heiser's work out of the unseen realm, Jesus is at Mount Hermon on this rock, which is multivalence going on there. It's not just Peter and the rock, but it's on this mountain, this place where the highway to hell is. It's this place where Jesus is stirring up, and he's calling forth all the powers of hell, saying, I'm here, do something about me, because I'm here, and we're ready to throw down and have a fight. And so even in geography there, of verse 1 and 2 of Isaiah 9, going down to verse 6, that famous Christmas passage about the governments that's being set up. It's all there in the geography. It's all tied into exactly what Jesus is doing. You could spend forever on Matthew 16. Yeah, that is just a huge touch point.
Yeah, agreed. There is a chock full of comments and themes and motifs that tie you right to that first century view. It's everything from the pagan theologies of the time that echo into that first and second and third century Christianity. It all ties together just perfectly.
And yeah, like I kind of hinted to, like one of the messianic psalms, the one that Jesus quotes on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? It goes on. It speaks of the bulls of Bashan encompassing him, and that is the region of the Caesarea Philippi, right? Bashan.
Yeah, I'm learning something new here too.
Yeah,
So
it's
this
good
is
stuff.
incredible. Yeah.
Oh yeah, well you talk about Moses. You know, when Moses went into the Promised Land, they tried at Kadesh Barnea, and that's tied to the Rephaim, and that's tied to the ancient spirits of the dead and those. Well, Tolkien picks it up in the Lord of the Rings when Aragorn takes those dead kings, dead leaders, the spirits, to fight. So it's kind of like you're dealing with that, and so they stop in Numbers chapter 13 and 14. They stop, and they're supposed to go north, and they don't because they rebel. So he takes them around Edom, takes them all the way up. Where does he take them to? Where does God take them to? He says, I want you to get I want you to take out the most important enemy there is. And he takes them right up through there to Bashan, to Og, to Sihon. He takes them right up there and destroys all that. Then he comes back down at Jericho. And then at Mount Nebo, Moses passes it over to Joshua, says, now go in, okay. But what they took out first and most important was Bashan. And that's where Jesus goes, back to there. And you have Moses, Bashan, you have Moses at the Transfiguration, you have all that tied in there. It's all tied, that geography. It's huge, it's massive. I mean, we're never going to come to the beginning of it. This is just the tip of the iceberg. So
yeah. Well, and you're speaking of Transfiguration, that's a beautiful touch point right there, because it also echoes forward into the Catholic tradition, showing how those on the other side still assist us. It's really cool the way that passage parlays into that first and second century theology.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty cool. But speaking of going back to the rock itself, that's also what the temple keys were affixed to. They were affixed to a rock when it was passed from priest to priest, from cycle to cycle. So again, there's that wordplay going on in the background, because he calls him the little rock, and the little rock is what the keys were affixed to. And it says that he will make him the rock, right? So the wordplay is a lot more clear in Greek, but you can see it.
Yeah.
Was this the first keychain then? Like, is it a little rock, like handheld or big? Or?
Well, the Polaroids.
What is interesting? Oh, sorry, I'm just saying to key off on that a little bit. What is interesting? The one place of authority the Jews had in the time of Christ at the temple was this stone that has the inscriptions of the boundary that Gentiles cannot cross here or they die. And so Jews were given rights to that rule, that rock, that stone. And it kind of represents the two pillars that's in the tabernacle or at the temple later on that they're trying to figure out at Solomon's temple. The two pillars that are upright, they also would be the boundary between the world below, the world of earth and under earth, and the heavenly realm inside the temple. And so the Jews were allowed by the Romans that anyone who violated that, and so they could take out Paul, because that's what they accused Paul of. They accused him of bringing a Gentile across that boundary, past that stone, into the holy place, into the holier confines of the temple and the sanctuary. And so it's a boundary marker to stop them. And so it's again like your keys, locking, unlocking, like binding and loosening, and back to what Zechariah was talking about with the binding, loosening, the rabbinical tradition, the authority with those keys. And so the Romans gave the Jews that authority. On that alone, they had the only authority. All else outside of that one thing, to my knowledge. Again, I agree with Suan. I don't know everything, but to my knowledge, that's the only authority the Romans gave the Jews for capital punishment. If you cross that line, that boundary, go past that stone, go past that, you're breaking that authority. You're breaking the binding, loosening aspect. Then they could act against Paul, and they could, have him killed. But that's again tying this authority, the keys, the whole thing is all laid out in there in the authority, even in the time of Christ.
Yeah.
But yeah, Moses has
awesome.
come up a lot, and I know you've done a bit of study there. Does that play into your whole thrust with the papacy?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of things that can be said about, the relationship between Moses and Christ and ultimately the papacy. So, I mean, for instance, I think it's now Ambrose all the way back had recognized, many of these parallels between Christ and Moses. And then we also know, based on Jewish tradition, that the people believed that when the Messiah would come, he would essentially be a second Moses. So that was intrinsically tied to the very idea of who the Messiah was going to be. So, for instance, Roger David Oss, in his book on John 21:15-19, he talks about how, for instance, the Jews during the time of Christ, they believed that just as Moses had saved Israel from Egypt, the new Moses would save Israel from Rome. So there was a lot going on there in terms of just the expectation that Christ would be the new Moses. In the paper that's getting published in Haythrop, I list out 10 parallels between Christ and Moses. Some of them are actually, like in the book of Hebrews, there's some, play between both characters. But I believe it's in the book of Mark and Matthew, there's a part where it says that Jesus looked upon the children of Israel and had pity on them as if they were sheep without a shepherd. And then when you go back to, I think it's the book of Numbers or Deuteronomy, either one of those, Moses is looking upon Israel and he sees that he's about to die. And it says that he looked upon them as if they were sheep without a shepherd. So there are some really remarkable parallels that are going on there that you just couldn't miss. Right.
Speaking of a remarkable parallel, like just this morning, I woke up early because like a friend of ours, I think he's gonna probably be on the podcast at some point. Robert is doing a Bible study, and we went over that very thing, and we were touching on the parallel of, and he was talking about that passage in Numbers. It was about the sheep.
Numbers. Okay, good.
Didn't have a shepherd, and then that's where Joshua comes in, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then basically to kind of finish some of the argument out, this is not the entire thing, but there's just some important bits here. We know that based on Jewish tradition, for instance, in the book of Enoch, 2 sheep are mentioned that Moses hands over to Joshua. In the Avot of Rabbi Natan, which includes the saying of the fathers, so the saying of the Jewish sages, Rabbi Natan records that I think there are some other sheep that were given to that Moses gave to Joshua. When you put these sources together, in Roger David Oss's book on John 21:15-19, and Oss is a Lutheran scholar, by the way. Oss makes the point that when you look at all the sheep that Moses handed to Joshua, you see that they're the same 3 sheep that Jesus hands to Peter in John 21:15-19. And at that point, then Oss concludes so then Jesus is in effect making Peter head shepherd after him. He's in effect making him his successor as the spiritual leader of the new Israel. And when I read that, I just kind of got goosebumps, like, wow, that's incredible. And there are other things that we can mention too. So for instance, we know that Sifra Pinhas 149, on the Petret Moshe, which comes a little bit later. And I'm trying to remember, but other like rabbinic sources around the time of Jesus, or at least after him, the Petret Moshe is after Jesus. We see that it was believed that Joshua received the throne of Moses. So at that moment in Deuteronomy 34:9, when Moses lays his hand on Joshua and he's filled with the Spirit, at that moment then it's believed that Joshua received the throne of Moses. So in effect then, that meant that all of the legal teaching authority of Moses was vested into one person. And then eventually Joshua distributes the power among the other judges. But the point here then is that if that's the case, then the early Christians who were Jews and understood the traditions, they would have seen Peter then as being seated on the throne of the new Moses. So then that's pretty significant, because then that seat is where all the authority to bind and loose comes from. That's where all the authority to make declarations ex cathedra, from the chair, from the throne, come from at that moment. So that's just something incredible that I noticed in some of my research. And, you know, the parallel between Moses and Christ and Joshua and Peter, it's pretty phenomenal.
Yeah,
Awesome.
that is.
Before-
And then, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, before we move on to the next point, so far, what do the non-Catholics think about those touch points so far?
Well, who are our non-Catholics?
Well, actually, I think there's only 3 of us that are Catholic. So,
I think it's I'll speak for some non-Catholics. I think it's interesting to hear, but it's really hard to grasp as a non-Catholic about the I guess authority as what I would call human, you know, to go from a deity to from a god to a human. I just can't grasp or comprehend where the similarity stops. Like part of me wants to say, well, you just trust Peter enough to make only good decisions, but it's just too hard. Maybe I'm just too jaded. But that's the one thing that I've always kind of veered away from Catholicism on is how much authority they give on humans across every church. You know what I mean? Like you can't vet enough, and you know we've seen in the past some of that stuff rears up your head. So it's interesting. I love the correlations, but it's definitely there's a part of me biting my tongue and like I don't know if it goes that far.
well, on that side of it, because I also faced those ideas as well on my journey into Catholicism. On those, it's very important to remember that you are not. It's not the person. It's not the person. It's the position. So just like if you have an officer arrest you, all right, he's arresting you under not his authority, but the authority he carries with him because of his position. So those are less to do with the people themselves, rather that's the positions they carry.
Yeah, I understand that, but when you have like Peter and Paul get into arguments about circumcision and stuff, at that point it becomes a human debate and give someone the decisions in this realm. I'd rather it come from God, you know, keep the keys, please. And take it back.
Well, and that's why there's always been a magisterium, because that way, remember, even when the Pope speaks infallibly, he speaks in accordance with the magisterium. So it's not a single person. So those are key takeaways, because I don't know about what you've read in history, but it's not too often that God says, by the way, I need you to do this. It's usually through people, right? He always works through people. So.
But yeah, speaking as someone who is maybe a little closer, more Catholic adjacent, I guess I'm much more sympathetic. But again, I have certain misgivings that it's all completely centralized in one figure, right? Where as opposed to when I'm looking at Second Temple stuff, I see it more spread out across the 70. And of course we do definitely have this idea of earthly representatives of a heavenly reality, right? And that was a massive turning point for my understanding of things. And I don't know if Suan is going to touch on any of the binding on earth as in heaven stuff. I know Crew knows about some of the stuff with that.
Yeah, do you mind if I come in,
Yeah.
or is there anyone else who wants to kind
please
of like
do.
contribute?
No, you're good.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, no problem. So I can understand like the hesitation towards kind of the Catholic teaching on authority, right? Because, we like just to kind of speak on something that came into my mind. I think in the West, we've kind of given up on the idea of like any human being having absolute authority over us, right? And this is largely because this is largely a byproduct of, as Americans, the American Revolution, which was inspired by the Enlightenment, which was inspired by these ideas like consent of the governed, and so on and so forth. But during the time of Jesus, we find a much different view of authority. And even in parts of Asia today, so speaking kind of from my cultural background, even if you don't like the person, you have to respect the office. Or for instance, even in the time of Jesus, right, in Matthew 23, 2-3, Jesus says, obey the Pharisees and everything that the scribes and the Pharisees and everything that they teach you, for they are seated on the throne of Moses. But do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they preach. What's fascinating here is that Jesus is recognizing the authority of the Pharisees, but at the same time, he's acknowledging they're not morally good people, so you can't follow them there. And I think for us in the West, we think, well, if the guy's not morally good, then I don't have to obey his authority, right? We can vote him out of office because we have a democratic society. But in the East, right, during the time of Jesus, what they care about was, okay, the guy might be bad, but was his authority or his position instituted by God? Which makes sense then of why Paul talks about in the book of Romans, obeying, the powers in place because they've been instituted by God. Or even in John 11, 51-52, after the resurrection of Lazarus, the Pharisees get together and begin to plot the death of Jesus. And then John includes this weird detail about how Caiaphas, when he had served as high priest of that year, had prophesied that Jesus would die for the sins of Israel and unite the children of God. So notice that even though Caiaphas was a morally deficient person, God nonetheless never took away his gift of prophecy. And even when he was high priest, he gave him the power to tell what the Messiah was going to do. So that during the time of Jesus, then the view of authority was a lot different than how we view it today in the West. And the question then is, did God animate and plant this authority? That's the question that they were asking. And the guy might be bad, but he still got a legitimate power from heaven. So for instance, Zechariah wanted me to talk about the parallel between heaven and earth, right? So we know, for instance, and Keener mentions this in his commentary on the IBP New Testament commentary, he mentions that during the time of Jesus, the Jews believed that the high court in Jerusalem, or the great Sanhedrin basically, that they could enact the decisions of heaven, such that whatever the heavenly tribunal had decided in heaven, the earthly tribunal in the Pharisees and the rabbis could enact those decisions. Now, there's a lot that I can say about, what's going on there, but basically this is why Jesus mentions whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. Jesus is saying basically the Pharisees and the rabbis, they have this power, but now I'm giving it to my apostles, my rabbis. I'm making a new high court. I'm making a new rabbinic authority planted upon the apostles themselves. So then that's where the connection between heaven and earth comes in. And I actually want to read a quote. So there's a rabbinic commentary by Rabbi Shabbatai Bass. He's a little bit later in the record, but what he shows, this is pre-Vatican I. So this is not like, I think this is over 200 years or 100 years before Vatican I. So this is not like motivated, right, by any Catholic doctrine. There's no a desire of the Jews to like kind of one up the papacy, right? This is before all of that happens. This is what Rabbi Shabbatai Bass writes. He says, quote, and this is on Deuteronomy 17:11 when Moses institutes the high court. He says, quote, even if, this is in Siftei Shakamin, even if he tells you, the judge, that what you consider right is left, and that what you consider left is right, you should listen to him and blame the mistake not on him, but on yourself, because Hashem always places his spirit on those who serve in his sanctuary, and he guards them from any error, so that only truth comes out from their mouths. So this idea of infallibility was in Judaism, and it gets handed on to Christianity. And thus, like when we say the Pope rules ex cathedra, that's actually something we got from Judaism, because when the high court would make a ruling, they would rule from the throne of Moses, ex cathedra, Moses cathedras. So those are some important details there to keep in mind.
I just want to also interject to Mike that Mike, if you think about Moses, we know he had his faults. We know like he got divorced and his brother and sister kind of bring that up and there's problems, but his father-in-law is what kind of God uses through Jethro to speak to him and says, you need to get the 70. And then we have the passing of Moses' spirit upon the 70, and that 70 is reflected in the 70 of Deuteronomy 32, 8, 9, Heiser's Deuteronomy 32 worldview, the Genesis 10 and 11 nations, the gods, the divine council, and that's reflected then. But it's interesting that it takes Jethro to kind of fire that into Moses. So Moses does listen to Jethro, and God speaks to Jethro to get Moses, because he knows, Moses, you're human, you're going to make a mistake, and you need this, okay? And so, and then I would encourage you also, Mike, to listen to Suan's debate with Ty, because Ty tries to bring in all of the stuff about Peter and Paul and the mistakes. And so Suan has dealt with that very nicely there. So as a non-Catholic, it's pretty nice to listen to him. He's dealt with the fact that Peter is not perfect. So but the idea is that that's the idea of God. You know, he started with Adam. He gave Adam the whole rule over all of creation, over everything. And Adam messed up, but God knew that, and he's fine with that. And then we have, like I said, the new Moses passing it on to the Joshua, the new Adam that passes on to his body, us. And so as God is forgiving of us, and we make mistakes, but we have each other as the body, we have the 70. And so in Luke 10, Jesus not only sends out the 12, he sends out the 70. You have that entire thing connected together. Okay, but it's all understanding that we've all been human, but God has done this from the beginning. From Adam, he gave authority for Adam to be the king and the priest of Eden, and take that out into the rest of the world, and how Adam fell. And still, God is still trying to do that when he started again with Noah, when he started again with, you know, each of us. So we're all forgiven. And so it's trying to pass that on so that we all reflect, as Exodus 19:6, kings and priests, that we all have that authority in a sense, that we're all in one accord, in unity. And that's what I think the Catholic tradition is trying to exemplify most, is that we're all trying to be in one accord here and decide together instead of one single private interpretation. Mike reads his King James Bible from 400 years ago and decides this is what this verse means. And all of a sudden he's going to say, okay, you have to do what I say because this verse says that, rather than your private interpretation. We're trying to take the entire tradition, Jewish and Catholic and Christian, all of it together. And you saw what he's been saying in this podcast here, how it took over Rome. Okay, Jesus is speaking again. That we talk a lot because Heiser is familiar with this audience about the Bashan, but there's a Roman aspect there, the Caesars, the Greco-Roman context to that place as well, not just Mount Hermon from the Old Testament, but the Greco-Roman sanctuary there of all their gods and all their rules, and how the church became the new Rome and took over and took over that. So we got to take in all of that, Mike. We're not talking about the last 2,000 years. We're talking about all of the Bible, all of the tradition, Jewish and Catholic, and the current state of affairs, and understanding that humans do fail and God is willing to still use us. So I really liked what Suan did in the debate with Ty on that, and how he was able to address that. And if he wants to do more of that here, I don't know, but it was really nice. So the listeners need to go get that and listen to that.
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I'm sure a lot of our listeners, because of course we've had Heiser on, we've had David Burnett on, so they might clue in when Suan mentions this celestial high court, and like, okay, something's going on there, because I know that is what hit me like a bombshell, because I'd been learning about the celestial court of God and all the Old Testament passages with that, and how Paul is utilizing all of that in his theology of the principalities and powers, etc. Right, and then it kind of hit me like a ton of bricks when I'm reading "Bind on earth as bound will have been bound in heaven." Right, and I'm like, oh. And
well, I don't think you got to bring, just a second, Zachary, I'm sorry, but I don't think Suan got to bring this point out in his debate with Ty, because Ty tries to bring up 16 as singular, where the keys are given only to Peter, and then in plural in chapter 18, and Ty tries to make something out of that. And I think that's what you're getting at, Hound, at least it is reverberating with me, that it's not just Peter, but then through Peter, then it's the authorities passed, and we all have access to this in some sense. So it's still the throne of Moses. It's still the one guy, but at the same time, it's coming down through Christ, through his body, through everything, and we're all participating. So it moves from just Peter, and then in chapter 18, it's plural. And so I don't think Ty was able to understand that's a progression. It's not, he's trying to make one a priority over the other. It's both and. Go ahead, Hound. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, I lost where I was.
Well, could I mention something real quick?
All right. Oh,
It-
go ahead.
Go for
Yeah,
it.
well, I just wanted to say that, yeah, I mean, so there's a question here on whether or not Peter, in what sense did Peter uniquely receive the keys, right? Because for me as a Catholic, I want to say in my conversion too, so it's not just me as a Catholic now wanting to say this, but even in my conversion, the question I asked myself was, okay, did Peter receive the keys and then we all got the keys? Is that kind of what happened? Is there a more institutional or hierarchical understanding of the reception of the keys, or, what's going on here? So I would say in response that one of the things to notice is that depending on how literally, or I don't want to say how literally, but for instance, a Catholic could say, well, look, it looks like Jesus is rebuilding the Davidic monarchy here, right? And if Jesus is rebuilding the Davidic monarchy, then we would expect a prime ministerial office, which he clearly seems to institute in 1619. And then we see the earliest Christians all unanimously saying, especially within living memory, that there were successors to the Petrine ministry. So much so that, for instance, Marcus Bachmuel, in his book, Simon Peter in Scripture and Living Memory, Bachmuel is a Lutheran, I believe, he acknowledges that Peter had successors to his ministry. And he says it is permissible to speak of successors to the Petrine See or something like that, even after the Reformation, right? So he acknowledges that Peter had successors to his ministry. Now, there's another point that I want to bring up, which is also the kind of church that Christ built, or the kind of priesthood that he left behind. So let me say this, right? So one of the big things I think that that people struggle with is this idea of apostolic succession. And the idea here, I think this is the clearest place where you see a hierarchical understanding of the church and the ministers and the priests and the bishops, right? So the idea of apostolic succession being that a church only has a valid, sacramental and teaching ministry if its bishop can trace his ordination back to the apostles. So one question you can ask yourself is, where is this stated in Scripture, right? So I would say that the first thing I'd point out is that we have the earliest Christian sources, especially Clement of Rome, who either wrote his letter First Clement in 68 AD or 96 to 99 AD. If it was written in 96 to 99 AD, then this would have been around the same time the Gospel of John and Revelation was being written. If it was 68 AD, which actually seems to be the most probable dating, then this would have been written perhaps before the Gospel of Matthew, Luke, and John, and it would have been probably one of the earliest Christian texts ever written aside from the Pauline epistles. And it might have, depending on which date you accept, predated Mark or come a little after. But regardless, Clement of Rome is writing a letter to the church in Corinth, and he's commanding them, don't depose your bishops and your clergy. These were instituted by Paul and Peter, right? And then he says in chapter 44, verse 1-3 of his letter, so too our apostles knew through our Lord Jesus Christ that strife would arise over the office of bishop. And therefore, having received perfect foreknowledge, they added those who are already mentioned, and afterwards added the provision to the effect that if these men should die, other men should succeed to their ministry. So that's within living memory of the apostles, within the apostolic age, you have this already being taught. And Clement of Rome, before I think it was the Council of Carthage that formed the canon, Clement's letter was read as scripture in the earliest Christian liturgies that we have. So Clement's letter was acknowledged as scripture on par with the rest of the apostles, although it doesn't make the final cut. So then, interestingly enough, we see, for instance, Ignatius of Antioch in 98 to 117 AD, on his way to die in Rome, he writes a series of letters to different churches. And he says, he talks about how the bishop is the image of the Father. And then he says the deacon is like the Son. And he compares the presbyters to the band and the council, the apostles, and I think he mentions the heavenly court. And then Ignatius says, and if you don't have these things, a bishop, a presbyter, a deacon, apart from these, a gathering cannot be called a church. And what's important here is that Ignatius is a disciple of John. So he knew one of the apostles and was ordained or trained by him. And then you have Irenaeus then in AD 180 saying, or 180 AD, saying, basically against against heresies. He writes in that book, all these other churches that are rising up with their heresies, I've asked them for their succession lists. Show me your bishops. I'll show you my succession list, right? I can trace my ordination back to John. You guys can't. And then some people think, well, okay, Irenaeus is just hyping himself up. He's just, kind of using a rhetorical device to defend himself. But then when you look at first century Palestinian Jewish practices, for instance, in Alfred Edersheim's book, The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah, he notes that when the Jewish authorities would appoint someone to the office of priest or judge, they would use the laying on of hands, and at least 3 men would usually perform the ceremony. At least one of the men had to be able to trace the ordination through Joshua and to Moses, or else the ordination was invalid. So when Irenaeus is talking about demanding a succession list, this is not a Christian in the 2nd century inventing this requirement. This was something that existed during the time of Jesus and the apostles, and it appears to have been handed down all the way into the 2nd century. Such that if we understand the apostles as the new rabbis of Christ, and we understand that Christ set up a new rabbinic authority, then the legitimate authorities that are instituted in the name of Christ, in the name of the new Moses, have to be able to trace their ordination through the new Joshua to the new Moses.
All right. Now, Mike had a rebuttal.
Well, it's sort of, I don't know, an evolution of the conversation in a way. What are your thoughts of, as society goes, so does the Catholic Church as far as tendencies? It seems like, when I was a youngster, Catholicism, they really stood their ground a lot. Divorce was really frowned upon, and it was public. Everything was public. Now it seems like, the current Pope has been more lenient, even to suggest to some that civil unions in homosexuality is now acceptable, which I didn't hear him speak, but it just seems like it's becoming more and more liberal, which I'm not saying is a good or a bad thing. I'm saying it's changing, and that directional arrow of even if you're talking God speaks through humans, of humans changing something on earth that had always sort of been a law, and then heaven following that. So the directional arrow points from earth to heaven instead of heaven to earth and then back to heaven, sort of thing. That's the part I'm having a hard time reconciling.
Right.
It seems like the church is evolving and becoming more liberal, but I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. I think the first thing I'd say is that I didn't become Catholic because I like the Pope. I have nothing against Pope Francis, but it's just like even if it was Pope Saint John Paul II, right? I mean, that wouldn't have shaped my decision at all. I became Catholic because of my love for Christ, and I realized, okay, this is the Davidic monarchy built on the earth. This is what the Jews were waiting for. This is the Messianic kingdom now, right? And then it'll be completed in the eschaton. But so I kind of just said when that hit me, I was like, okay, I'm willing to trust, because I trust the testimony of the men who lived 2,000 years ago and saw the Jesus that I love. And even though they wrote their testimonies maybe 20, 40, 60 years after the fact, I trust that God protected them. I trust that in the 2nd century, God didn't let his church fall to pieces immediately, right? And I noticed that this is part of the Christian life, to trust. And I said, okay, God, I'm having a hard time trusting everything the Catholic Church says. And I guess like God had the grace of at least saying, okay, look at the first 2 centuries. Look at those within living memory, Suan. That's all you got to do. And when I did that, I started realizing, wait, there's enough here to get me the rest of the home stretch, so to speak. The second thing I'd say is when it comes to the civil unions and kind of Pope Francis's position, I mean, one of the things is that, Catholics are going to emphasize that like Pope Francis is not speaking ex cathedra. So technically speaking, it doesn't like fall under strict adherence of the church, right? The other thing is that it's interesting. I think it was the Bishop of San Francisco or the Archdiocese of San Francisco. One of them, they actually wrote a letter and they explained that Pope Francis's comments were to some extent taken out of context, right? So Pope Francis was talking about civil unions not just for gay couples, but also, let's say, for a brother and sister, or a brother and a brother, or a sister and a sister who live together and they wanted to share property and have joint bank accounts and that sort of thing, right? So could also apply to non-sexual unions. So then by consequence, it would apply to a gay couple, right? Because Pope Francis was saying, well, I want them to at least have that legal property recognition under law, which is something that I think some libertarians and others I've heard are sympathetic towards. But the other thing too is, Pope Francis also recently said, the church can't bless sin in reference to gay marriages in Germany, So,
Thank you,
Pope
Pope.
Francis,
Right.
yeah, I mean, yeah, he's our guy.
So I kind of want to be the oh, go on.
Wait 1 second. And we're going to get one word from our sponsor. And pause. Okay. So I'm going to fire the heat up right here. This part we're not recording.
I was about to bring in the ghost of Joe Chen there.
Where are you going with that? Keith, is that the baby, or you really a bottle of vodka?
I was trying to wrap a bottle of vodka in here actually, but no, this is the baby. This is Oscar.
That's beautiful, Keith. Fire something real quick. I'm starting to breathe. I don't know if you are. It's chilly here.
Yeah, I told you it drops.
Well, it's like all the rain is humid, and then the weather drops. So it's like goes back to your phone. It's like inconsistency. It's driving me nuts.
I'll be right back, guys. I need a quick trip here.
Yeah, that's why I made that suggestion. I was like, sure. Now, are we doing a different drink? Let's refill. Okay. We're at the hour. I don't know what that is. You use some camp references now. Oh, that sounds like. How do you like the show? I can't like it. All looks the same. It looks like new lighting is the only thing I see. Oh, I put in brand new shells. Oh, I thought that was always there. Yeah, no, it's all brand new. It's like a limited edition. That's the thing. You do something that looks like it should be there, because it has heard like it was always stop. Where's Kendra? Get a haircut. Those pants. She made my nice. Right, we are about to go. We'll read it for a band. More I see that. There it is. Yeah. That's a good one. I paid $40, $45 for that one. Wow. All right, we take a leak and we're back on. All right, almost there. Aaron's got the $60 herb over there. Where are the nutritional facts though? I didn't know how many calories. Did you just ask for nutritional facts from bourbon? I need to know how many miles I have to run tomorrow. Is that simple? Still ready? Yeah. Good. Yeah, upped it to like. Well,
Technically, it's null on calories.
yeah. Yeah. Tastes like I'm drinking pure sugar. Kills COVID.
Oh, that's
or
the syrup.
roses.
That's the syrup.
Oh, so straight bourbon? Are you joking? It's really zero.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's why most people, when they drink,
How are you enjoying it so far, Suan?
Oh, you're talking about the interview? Oh yeah, I'm having fun. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just also want to know, like, how much longer do you guys want me to be on? Getting tired of me yet, or?
I mean, when we had David Burnett on, we had to like split the interview into 3 episodes.
Whoa.
So I think there were like 3 episodes up of that interview. So it's like when it runs out, it runs out.
All right, sure, okay.
When do you get tired of us? I mean, it's morning over here. I can do this all day.
I'd rather go ahead and resolve this now. We can do that if it's
Yeah, we can definitely do that.
Someone was asking
Yeah.
how much longer you think.
Oh, how much? So we don't have to keep you on if you have to go. We can do another 20 minutes if you have to go.
Yeah, I mean, 20, 45, whatever, I'm good. Just like around that time range because it's getting a little late
All right.
here and I, want to spend time with my sister and stuff like that. Yeah.
I totally get it. Yeah, I totally get it.
hmm
There we go.
As long as this baby isn't screaming, I have a couple thoughts to weigh in after Zechariah, as long as we're continuing on the same thread.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Me too.
I might just need a second to reach for the mute button.
Mike?
No, I'm gonna stay.
All right. Well, that's your call.
It's your choice. Well, I mean, I think it's 1 year old, like
Not bad, right?
you're sipping like around a fire or something.
There you go. There you go.
So are you familiar with David Burnett, Swan?
No,
We
I'm
keep
not.
talking about him. Okay, so we all met primarily through a guy named Dr. Michael Heiser, his book The Unseen Realm,
hmm
and he has the Naked Bible podcast. So David Burnett is a pastor from Texas that kind of was connected to Dr. Heiser's work, was on his podcast several times. It really resonated with us. He's up at Marquette now doing his PhD, and so you'll probably like his podcast on either Dr. Heiser's Naked Bible podcast or here. So he's just phenomenal. He's a very well, like you, very well thought out, thinks everything very, very extended out. So yeah, I really want to get him back on here to talk about Christology, to get into some of the things that we've been talking about. So as far as how you relate Christology and Christ and him being God and him being man, and then this authority we're talking about passing to someone like the Pope. So I hope we can get him back on sometime to discuss that. But yeah, you'll
And-
probably like the podcast.
And so, yeah, like
Ready to jump back in.
so when I was getting into Burnett, I was reading one of his articles,
Hey guys.
and then I saw like right
Yes, sir.
above one of his articles, he had like Michael Barber's article, Cultic Theosis in Paul, and I was like, that's cool. I like that. And then I kind of went from there to some of his other stuff, which is what led me onwards. And apparently, Aaron here is going to get him on Barber on for an episode. He co-authored the new book on Paul with Petrie.
We're,
So those are like the
planning
two
out a
big,
date.
Big
planning out
Catholic
a date.
scholars right now on Stair, Petrie, and Barber.
All right, you guys ready?
You?
All right.
Fire away.
All right. Ready? Yep. Oh, we're good. And we're back. Sorry, we had to refill these amazing Manhattans with that lovely Four Roses bourbon. We are refilled and ready to go. I believe we were, who had the mic when we left? Was it Mike? I believe Mike had the mic.
I don't know. I think I dropped it. I think.
Yeah, I think.
Mike's dropping the mic?
Yeah, I think I was about to chime in here. With,
All right.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm going to be the ghost of Joe here, who is always present with us in spirit. So his whole read on the movement of the church, and especially with the current pope, is he always goes to like this one obscure interview like that Francis has, where Francis kind of dives. I think it was with like the head of the Jesuits or something, and he actually gets into the method to his I don't want to say madness, but that's the colloquial thing there. So, which is that he's always kind of pushing on people and saying very vague things to push things, and then he pulls back on them. And a lot of people, I think a lot of people don't remember, like when he came early on in his career, he actually made some very conservative reforms in his work, even before he attained the office of Pope, right? But like even with like one of the controversies recently, which like the Amazon Synod or whatever, he set this whole thing up and everybody kind of panicked. And there was all this big doom about, oh, he's going to change church teaching. And then the Synod happened and Francis was like, okay, that happened. We're not going to do anything with this, right? So it seems with him, he's always kind of pushing on people to see where they're going to go with what he says, but he's always very careful in what he says so that somebody can always say, oh, this is what he actually meant, or he can always just not go through with something, right? And every now and then he'll make this
And I
very, yeah. Go on.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems like I had going in, or I thought I was going to have going in, is anyone who knows a little bit about history knows that there's been some bad popes, right? Well, so I thought that would be a hang up for me. However, I will say this going in, not a single one of the bad popes ever influenced any church teaching. They just kind of let the teaching lie. And so that spoke volumes of me. It kind of harkens back to the Davidic kings, right? There was a lot of bad Davidic kings, but if you look at the series of popes, even the bad popes, they didn't change anything in teaching. They didn't change a dogma. They didn't change anything. So that spoke volumes to me. The fact that it didn't change what we were supposed to believe.
I got something here real quick before it goes.
Yes.
It's too far in the rearview mirror. Mike, I thought your comment was really interesting about the trajectory of the church in our lifetimes, maybe starting more conservative and becoming, more liberal in attitude with the Pope. And I fully acknowledge this is probably my lefty Catholic tendencies that are coloring this perception. But I feel like in the trajectory of my life, it was like the church started out coming out of Vatican II as turning left, and the right, especially in the US, really asserted itself and pushed a lot of those voices, the left voices, to the sideline. And with Pope Francis, it's too early to tell. It's like we're right in the middle of it. It's hard to see where that lands. But kind of going to the what teaching changes and what doesn't. I had just mostly finished reading Pope Francis's apostolic exhortation on, I guess, the translation is Joy of Love. It's Amoris Laetitia. And this is the one where, if you read about in the news, you probably read about a footnote that a bunch of, that the people kind of went crazy over about potentially allowing divorced and remarried Catholics to receive communion. But the whole chapter 8 of it is a very interesting and I think uniquely Catholic assertion of traditional teaching, but also like this acknowledgement that there can be grace in the lives of people who are living in imperfect situations, people who maybe are cohabitating or divorced and not remarried in the church, things like that. So it's like he emphasizes very much. He's not changing teaching, but he's backing off of the idea that we need to lead with, hey, you're doing a really bad thing here, because everybody already knows they're not living up to the measure, and talking about, not differentiating between like grave matter and sins that are always sin, and whether those sins are, say, mortal sins in the life of an individual, and acknowledging that, hey, a lot of this is based off of what people have learned, the situations they live in, how intractable those situations are, and that it's basically the big subtext of the chapter is don't judge. We haven't changed anything, but don't judge.
Yeah, I like that. I like the point of, actually, I never thought of the point that maybe the right kind of inserted itself to change my perception, because I've only got that opinion for a while. But I mean, to kind of validate some of the opinions, when Moses allowed the people to divorce and kind of Jesus said, well, that it's not really what we intended. Moses was doing that for the people rather than for God. But still, it almost seemed to loose it in heaven because Moses loosed it on earth. And that's the confusing part as a Christian. I guess I just want to be a sheep in this case, where I want, you know what I mean? I want it only to come from God. So it does make it confusing, like it's only half loose because Jesus still doesn't totally agree with it. Yeah, it is confusing.
Well, to go back to what Suan was saying, so here's a quote right here, and it's very interesting. It's by Irenaeus, and I believe part of this quote is what you were getting at. It says, since, however, it would be very tedious in such a volume as this to reckon up the succession of all the churches, we do put to confusion all those who are in whatever manner, whether by an evil pleasing or by vainglory or by blindness and perverse opinion, assemble in unauthorized meetings. This I say by indicating that tradition derived from the apostles of the very great, the very ancient, and universally known church found and organized at Rome by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul. Also by pointing out the faith preached to men, which comes down to our time by means of the succession of the bishops. For it is a matter of necessity that every church should agree with this church on account of its preeminent authority. So right there, this is Irenaeus in his time saying that people must agree with Rome.
So, as the other Protestant in the room, I don't know who else is. I don't know, I think on, going back to the authority of, the authority issue and through the succession through Peter with the Catholic Church, for me, the broader implications is what I'm most concerned with.
Right.
It's being on the wrong team and not being on the right side of eternity. That to me is the heart of it with all different denominations, whatever it is, whether it's Anglican or whether it's, pick your denomination that's not Catholic, whatever.
Right.
All right, or other religion. That's what divides us, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're afraid that like I remember Michael Heisen saying one time, when it's all said and done, are we going to be quibbling about the right point of view or whose outlook was right?
Yeah.
So when it's all said and done for each one of us, we as a Protestant, that's what rubs us wrong the most about, if I may use, if lack of better words, Catholic dogma, that we're on the wrong side of the team. We're not going to make it there with you guys.
Yeah.
Because we're not on the right team.
So
and that's where the authority piece, and us rub the wrong way.
And I totally get where you're going with that. The one thing I do love, and I don't know if Suan and Keith ever touched on this before, the one thing I've always loved since coming over is the fact that there is forgiveness on that. For, like, let's say you weren't brought up as Catholic or introduced to the Catholic Church, or you're Hindu or Buddhist. If you were never introduced to the faith, you may still find salvation because you haven't actually rejected the rock, right? So you haven't actually rejected that authority because you were never raised in that tradition, and the Catechism doesn't allow for that. And so that's kind of the beauty of it. Whereas when I was Protestant, I was never sure if I could be saved, because you have, on one side you have to speak in tongues, on the other side you're predestined, and then so there was a lot of confusion before coming Catholic, and now becoming Catholic, it's like the road, the road's narrow, but at the same time, finding that way, I don't have to worry about all these things.
So I guess my question would be then, is Christ's church, the church, only Catholic?
Suan, go ahead.
Yeah, punt the big question to me, huh? Yeah. All right, so here's what I'm going to do. I think one of the biggest things that shaped my conversion was John 14:15. It's where Jesus says, "If you love me, then you will do as I command." And I started thinking more about, okay, if I love Christ, then what did he command? And, throughout my whole conversion, facing the rejection of my parents, the rejection of my community, the rejection of old friends, of childhood friends, the pain that all of that brought. Uh, I realized that I wouldn't have had to have made that decision had the Reformation not happened. You know, we wouldn't be in this tense state had the Reformation not happened, right? Or had Luther perhaps done his Reformation differently, had he waited, had he petitioned, had he done this or that. So I the way that I see it sometimes, it's as if, like, you know, after the Reformation, we're trying to change the rules, right? When in reality, what was supposed to be there was that original unity, or what Christ talks about in John, I think it's 17:21, Father, let them be one, just as you and I are one, right? So it's not like you get to break up the church and then say, here's how we have to do ecclesiology, right? And I don't want to say that that's what you're doing. I'm saying about the Reformation itself and the phenomenon of this division that we're in right now. But to kind of bring it back, so then is the question is the Catholic Church the only Church of Christ? And then my question would be, what are the identifiers of the Church of Christ? So how do we identify the Church of Christ on the earth? Well, one, it's going to be one, as the scriptures teach. It's going to be holy. It's going to be universal or Catholic, meaning it's for the entire world. And it's going to be apostolic, right? As Ephesians 2:20 says, the church is built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. So then when I bring up all these other arguments about the Jewish ordination rite, about how the church understood its authority, for instance, Christ gave the apostles the authority to build his church. And he even says in Luke, I think 10:16, whoever hears you hears me. Whoever rejects you rejects me. And whoever rejects me rejects the one who sent me. So Jesus took the ministry of the apostles incredibly seriously. And by the fact that as Christians, Christ is our Messiah, he's our King, he's our Lord, we got to take what he takes seriously as well. So when we begin to look at, for instance, who the Messiah was, we know that the Messiah was supposed to be the new Moses. He's supposed to be the new David and the new Adam. As Catholics and Protestants, we agree that Jesus is the new Adam because he saved us from sin and saved us from the penalty of sin. So I'm not saying that you're not saved, right? That's not what I'm saying. When it comes to Jesus being the new Moses, right? Well, what was the new Moses supposed to do? Well, the Jews believed the new Moses was going to conquer Rome. Which church claims to have a special association with Rome? Which church claims to be the fulfillment of messianic prophecy in that way? Or for instance, the new David. Which church actually is built after the Davidic kingdom? Which church actually has the prime minister that Christ instituted 2,000 years ago? Which church has apostolic succession? Which church can honestly look at the Bible and the historical context of the scriptures and say, we have what the apostles did? And that's what I'm going to say. That's where the Catholic Church truly comes out. Because, for instance, I think that a lot of Protestant churches will define oneness as oneness in the essentials. They'll define holiness in terms of Christ's holiness imputed to us. They'll talk about Catholicity in terms of just how the gospel's for everyone, right? But when it comes to the apostolicity of the church, Ephesians 2:20, Luke 10:16, and in John 20:23, Jesus breathing upon the apostles, right, and sending them out on their ministry. Which church can honestly say it has the apostolic foundation and can historically and honestly trace itself back to the original preaching of the apostles and the earliest Christians?
Yeah, that's a great rebuttal. And I'd like to throw it back in your court.
I mean,
Yeah, we know
it's
back and forth on
complex.
this one.
It's very complex because it is, for me as someone who I was born and kind of raised in the Catholicism, but only sort of like the Christmas and Easter Catholicism. But then when I read the Bible and sort of it stripped me down to my roots of faith, to where I kind of shed a lot of the stuff that my peers would talk about because they weren't true Christians, and it kind of gave me a relationship with God in a way that, if you go back to before Catholic Church was established, you had that direct line, and I think I get what you're saying, Swan, is that you're not really committing to that Catholicism is the only way to salvation, but it is something that if you really grasp on the historic avenue of it, there's a little bit more to fight on to. But I don't know. I feel like we can all kind of trace our roots back into some sort of rabbinic legacy in a way. And so I don't know. That's just not something I'm not afraid of not being on the right side of eternity, I guess.
But then,
Well, and for his, and oh, go ahead, Swan.
well, I just wanted to say too, like, I mean, so, you know, when you look at how Jesus describes heaven, or for instance, when the apostles, they say, Jesus, hey, we gave up everything for you. What do we get in return? What's our reward? You know, Jesus says to the apostles, I'll give you 12 thrones from which you'll judge Israel, right? In the parousia, the restoration. Or even, you know, when Christ describes the prodigal son and the son's forgiven, and you know, the prodigal son, he just says, God, just give me he says, Father, give me just, you know, I'm only worthy of being a slave. You know, give me just, you know, some clothes and some food, and that's it. That's all I deserve. And then the father lavishes the son and gives him more than what's quote unquote necessary. And what I want to say to you is that when we look at who Jesus is, especially when he says, if you love me, then you'll do as I command. When we look at Jesus as the new David, the new Moses, and as the new Adam, Jesus, our elder brother, right, the Son of God, he wants to spoil you because he loves you. And he gave you a kingdom where you can be spoiled with the sacraments, with grace, with his love, where you can have a historic connection 2,000 years back to the apostles themselves. Jesus doesn't want us to just have, quote unquote, the essentials or the necessary. Jesus, like a good father, wants to spoil us with his kingdom. And then for me as a Catholic, then when things seem kind of, you know, people say to me, Swan, why is there so many extra things, or why is there so much in Catholicism? It's because Jesus, as a good father, as a Middle Eastern, you know, host, he wants to put food on the plate. He wants to keep on giving and loving and giving all of himself to us, so that when I look at the Catholic faith, you know, for instance, Paul talks about how one day, you know, we're going to judge the angels. Paul talks about how, you know, we're going to participate in the kingship of Christ. Right. The reason why the Catholic Church is so important, aside from the fact that Christ loves us and wants to spoil us with more than we can handle, is because this kingdom that Christ came to bring as the Messiah, right, the Davidic Messiah, this kingdom that he's giving us, it's preparing us for the end of the world, when you and I finally get to rule alongside Christ himself. So then why wouldn't you want to be in the kingdom now? Why wouldn't you want to listen to what Christ is saying through the apostles and over 2,000 years of history? You know, so for me, the papacy and these things, even though they can sometimes get institutional and yucky, right? Like, oh, there's just so much baggage, right?
Yeah.
The beauty of it, right, is that it's a kingdom. It's a gift that Christ has given to us, and that's why he wants us to prepare for when we rule with him in the eschaton, in the end of the world. And so I want to say to you, like, I'm saying, you know, I'm not telling you to do this on pain of hell, right? That's not, I'm not trying to back you into the corner. I'm saying do this on pain of love for Christ and the fullness of what he has given you. That's all I'm saying.
That's beautifully put.
Yeah, no, it is. And you know, and our response to that would be is that we believe that we are, and we have been, and we will continue to do so. The other thing that is that it feels like it hinges upon hierarchy so much, a system, and you know, to Swan's earlier comment about why the West rejects it, I totally agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
It's filtered through so much hypocrisy that we view, you know, our leaders here in the West through. There's been everything is viewed through that now,
Yeah.
especially after 2020. You know, we have our 2020 goggles on, and we see the world just kind of go.
Yeah.
So my point is to that is it feels like it hinges on that.
Yeah.
And
I see where you're coming from.
yeah, I just don't think that's.
Yeah.
It just needs to hinge on.
Well, I mean,
I want to talk about.
We only have Swan for a few more minutes, so I'd like to weigh in with Theo and the Hound.
I just wanted to say about text and tradition. As a scholar, you know, I'm not allowed to just say whatever I want to, and I can't plagiarize, and I can't just do what I want. So I appreciate like Swan so much, because in his interview, and even when we began, you know, we finally got a little bit more personal with his testimony, but at the beginning, he was quoting scholar after scholar after scholar after scholar after scholar, because he wants to be right, but it's not Swan speaking, it's the entire tradition. So it's easy to quote John 3:16 or your favorite Bible verse and have a private interpretation. But what what Suan does as an academic, we are trying to take the entire conversation as it has occurred throughout all of God's people and integrate that into what we're trying to say. So it may seem hierarchical, but at the same time, the logic doesn't make sense. Being a Protestant, this logic does not make sense. Okay. On one hand, we're scared of the Pope because he can just say whatever, and all of a sudden he has the authority and he can tell me what to do and I have to obey him. But on the other hand, we say, well, I reject 2,000 or 3,500 years of tradition. And I say the Bible says this. And so on one hand, we're arguing against hierarchy. On the other hand, we want to be free and believe whatever the Bible says. But that's where tapping into that independence, wanting our current modern understanding of freedom versus classical freedom to be what we want to. And it seems like you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't argue against hierarchy, but at the same time, and then want your freedom. So you can't be scared of the Pope can tell me whatever, but then I'm going to have authority to say over. And so before you can speak, you have to be able to back it up academically. Well, before the Pope or the church acts, they back it up with tradition, and they're trying to say this authority is not coming from one man. It's coming from 3,500 years or whatever the number is of tradition backing up these statements so that, yeah, God allows Moses to get a divorce, okay? Because, well, he had to get things going because Moses is not perfect. But that's not the way it was from the beginning, okay? So not everything is right, but God offers the grace that Suan was talking about, that the priest is walking in when he's wearing those 8 garments, that grace for forgiveness to restore us. And what Francis is trying to do, what we said, is that Francis doesn't want to focus on the sinner being a sinner and sin. He wants to focus on the reconciliation of bringing us all right with Christ, however that may be. And for some people, they're not able to make the jump into Roman Catholicism, but we're all Catholic in a sense. So it just depends on how you weigh that out. So remember that when you're talking about text and tradition, and I love Dave Burnett, and I'm going to have to quote this one more time. So Dave, I hope you're listening, but when you told the Heiser that basically scripture is tradition, it's the traditions that were passed on and written down and cherished by the church. And that's what the text is. The text is tradition. So how can we separate those two? You really can't. Anyway, I think Hound wanted to get in here.
Yeah. So my going back a bit, I don't think, and Swan alluded to this, even if he didn't like specifically get to it. It doesn't seem this isn't a question of from my reign. This isn't a question of become Catholic or go to hell, right? It's a question of, okay, there's a high likelihood that say you've been baptized, you're likely on your way upwards, but here is what Christ has instructed. So if that's proved to you, you should probably go towards that thing. That's my interpretation of what's going on here. So
All right.
my
Yeah.
I was
but yeah, I think Theo and I are in sort of this weird position where I think we've gotten to the point of, okay, we know there's hierarchy, we know that's there, and I'm sort of in the position like, okay, I know there's this Petrine succession going on. So the question where it's like, okay, how does that actually play out, right? And yeah.
real quick, can I throw something in here?
Yes, please.
As I've been reading, especially lately, just a lot. I don't know, for some reason, I've just been reading a lot of stories of people who've, left the Catholic Church or even sometimes left Christianity altogether, and listening to very sincere, well thought out people express their differences. I've started translating in my mind when someone says like, hey, I'm an ex-Catholic, or I'm not a Catholic because of this, or I'm not a Christian because of this, or whatever. sometimes I translate in my head as Catholic in exile. There's a lot of people who have really thought hard and have found something that's just, it seems incompatible with their understanding of how life works. That isn't like something where they're being obstinate or clinging to something that's necessarily easy. They've wrestled with it and they're just not there. And I think, I mean, especially as I read the writings of Pope Francis, it's very clear to me that the Catholic Church, the stance of the Catholic Church isn't, if you've heard the message of Catholicism, you are bound, regardless of what your brain thinks, to accept it. You're not asked to leave your conscientious objections. God calls us all to think and consider these things and get closer, to Him in the way a well-formed conscience, empowers us to do. So I think Catholic tradition actually upholds that really strongly.
Yeah, can I say one last thing, and then I gotta get going because I gotta go to church tonight. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
I understand.
Yeah, I mean, so I really like what Keith said, and I really appreciate what Theo and Zechariah had to say. Yeah, I mean, so one of the things, so for instance, the church teaches that if God does reveal to you that the Catholic Church, this is in Vatican II, by the way, the council that everyone claims, got us in this whole liberal mess, right? Vatican II actually says that if God reveals to you that the Catholic Church is the one true church and you reject it, then that's when condemnation comes in, right? Because then this is God showing you a part of Himself in a way, showing Himself to you, and then you just say no, right? I mean, so yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that like, oh, if you say no right now, then there's a fire waiting for you. No, that's not it. And the other thing is too, one of the things that I think, growing up as a Protestant, I listened to people like William Lane Craig and other Catholic apologists, and they'd always say, follow the evidence wherever it leads. Or I listened to great Catholic Christian thinkers who would tell me like, you have to be open to the fact that you could be wrong. And then I started thinking more and more, like as I started investigating the claims of the Catholic Church and taking it more seriously, am I going to follow the evidence wherever it leads? Am I ready to potentially be wrong if I am wrong, right? And then, while I was in my conversion process, I remember like I prayed to Jesus, Lord, make me a child again. I'm like this adult now who has all these baggages and burdens and these things that I want to uphold, right? Like my reputation, my place in the community. Make me a child again and just let me view the evidence with new eyes. And honestly, like even though I face like pain and rejection and all that from becoming Catholic, and as a Catholic, I have to constantly live with people, straw manning my position or saying all sorts of things against me. For Christ, I do it all over again. And in losing everything for Christ, I gained everything in return because I got the fullness of what He started, of who He is. So, yeah, I mean, honestly, sometimes I get worried when some people say, like, I present the evidence and they just say, oh, well, like, I don't care, or, so what, and then I'm kind of like, well, I mean, if you have a heart like that, then what is your heart going to be like when God calls you to sacrifice something even greater? Right? Or even, I think about in Matthew 23:2-3, if Jesus told you to obey the rabbis and the Pharisees, would you do it? Would you take your king's words that seriously? Or if Jesus, when He told the apostles to give up everything, not even to bury their own mother and father, and just go now, I mean, would you make the move? And I'm not saying you as in you guys directly in the studio or online. I'm just saying you in general, right? Like, the intensity of who Christ is, the intensity of our King. When I looked at the evidence and I started, and even right now I'm trying to study the Jewish roots of Christianity in the early church, I started realizing I can't, with an honest intellectual mind, this is me speaking personally, I couldn't honestly look at the evidence and go away not being Catholic. And I'm not saying you guys are intellectually dishonest or anything like that, right? But I'm saying, wrestle with the evidence. And if you're ultimately honestly not convinced, then yeah, can't wait to see you on the other side, and let's see if Jesus says I'm right.
So Suan, again, where can everybody find you?
Yeah, so I have a podcast on Apple Podcasts called Intellectual Conservatism. I have a YouTube channel by the same name. And then also If you stay tuned, I'm going to try and get the article out from Haythrop. So I'll have actually academically published work, and I wouldn't mind sharing that with your viewers and your listeners and even you guys. So yeah, and I have a Patreon account. So I appreciate the help, but it's not about the money for me. And then, like I'm actually planning on becoming a Dominican priest, and we make a vow of poverty. So I'm not going to need that money anyway pretty soon. So just for the time being, I just appreciate it, but it's not about the money. I just care about coming out and sharing how I feel like Christ has impacted my life.
Awesome. Much appreciated.
You have my vote for president. You can donate your presidential salary back.
Well, based on him quoting all those scholars, he needs the money to buy books.
Yeah,
that's the struggle.
You and all your work, and your heart behind everything you do, and we will support you here, man. And it's the taboo of a brew.
That's right, Zechariah.
No, it is
Okay.
good.
Heath?
The baby on my lap has sapped all meaningful thought from my brain.
All right. Theo?
I just said, being in academics, I know as many scholars as he's quoted, he needs money to buy the books so he can study. So yeah, that's what he's going to do with it. So
I was
they're
agreeing.
expensive.
That is the
So
struggle.
yeah, that's a really big struggle to get the academics. So yeah, support that Patreon account, and then he's going to study more. And you've seen today, and if you go to his previous, we've been talking about that debate with Ty. If you go to his YouTube channel, and you see all the scholars he's quoting, you can see what this man has done. And he just said, when did you become Catholic? One more time.
Pentecost 2020.
There you go. So you see all of this research he's done in the short time. And if you support him at that Patreon account, before he becomes Dominican, how much more studies can he accomplish? Okay, so yeah, as a scholar in the missionary field, it's very difficult to come across scholarly material. So yeah, support him.
All right. And please reach out to us. We're on Facebook and Twitter and every social media platform. Please pay for our beers on Patreon or write to Bible Over Brews on Anchor.fm. Thanks. Have a great night.
Peace.
Wow.
All right. Thank you.